With this lesson, we start talking about clause 8 of the standard, which is of course operation. Operation is basically about having appropriate control over the creation and delivery of products and services. Now, the first subclause of operation, or clause 8, is of course operational planning and control. Basically, the organization is required to plan, implement, and control the processes needed to meet requirements for the provision of products and services, and to implement the actions determined in 6.1. These are, of course, the actions to address risks and opportunities. This could be done by determining the requirements for the products and services, basically identifying the needs, and establishing the criteria for the processes and acceptance criteria, basically doing a system or providing a system with which the organization shall work with, and of course identifying or determining the resources needed, whether it's money, people, and equipment, implementing the control of processes, and of course retaining documented information. If you want to take a few examples of how to work by these actions, we can name a few examples, like setting up supplier accounts or trade accounts, or purchasing stock to have a stock in your organization, and ensuring personnel have correct skills and competence, and of course understand the process that they will work on, and of course purchasing tools and vehicles, basically purchasing the equipment and tools, and making sure that we have, or the organization has, enough personnel for the specific tasks, and of course issuing clear instructions, drawings, procedures and risk assessments to enable personnel to do their jobs. Now, as the standard suggests, the organization is also required to show clear control of the process. In other words, the organization is expected to check that delivery is as expected, and that deviations or changes and negative impacts are controlled. This same control should be applied to subcontractors or to personnel belonging to subcontractors. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor shall ensure that requirements for the products and services are identified and or of course determined. And also the auditor needs to review any documented information, like project plans, before the organization and the customer commit to work. The auditor is also required to ensure that any actions or measures to meet all applicable legal requirements are taken. The second subclause of clause 8 is requirements for products and services, which is in turn divided into other 4 subclauses or 4 parts. The first one is customer communication, which is basically about how the organization relates to the customer. So the organization needs to establish the processes for communicating in relation to information relating to products and services. Basically, what is the organization selling? And also the inquiries, contracts, or order handling, including changes. Basically, how can customers expect to be dealt with? And also obtaining customer views and perceptions, including customer complaints. So we're talking about reviews here, we're talking about getting feedback. And also handling or treatment of customer property if applicable. If we're talking about the customer property, how does the organization treat that property or handle that property? So we're basically looking after the customer's property. And also the specific requirements for contingency actions when relevant. Basically, what plans does the organization put in place if something goes wrong? We could take a few examples. For instance, the organization could allocate a specific person to the customer that handles all communication, so that positive and negative feedback is captured and dealt with. Another example, if you want, is when engineers or security officers work around customers' property. A process should be in place to protect the personnel or these engineers from being accused of of damage or theft. When we say a process, maybe a process could include a site survey or risk assessment and reports. Now, auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to ensure who's responsible for the customer communication. Is it the whole department, or is it just one person? And also the auditor needs to ensure the reliability and the accuracy of information regarding products and services. The auditor could take a look, of course, at the website of the organization, and also how does the organization respond to customer communication requests. So we're talking here about the complaint handling process. If the customer wants to complain about the service or the product, how does the organization respond to that? How long does it take for the organization to respond to that? So this is basically the complaints handling process, and also the effectiveness of the communication between the customer and of course the organization. The second part or second subclause for the requirements for products and services is determining the requirements related to products and services. Basically, the organization needs to establish a process to determine the requirements. We're talking about customer requirements, regulatory requirements, or legal requirements. We're talking safety requirements and organizational requirements or industrial requirements for of course the products and services to be offered to potential customers. And so basically the organization needs to ensure that it has the ability to meet those requirements and substantiate and prove the claims for the products and services it offers. So the organization needs to be clear about what is required in order to sell their products and services, and must be able to deliver what it's selling. Let's take the example of an organization or maybe a customer who wants to install an intruder system or an alarm system. First, the organization needs to understand the insurance requirement from the customer. In other words, what type of system they desire, or maybe which grade they want. The organization could also run a test to prove to the customer to prove the claims of the products and services that it offers. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor is required to evaluate the process or method to determine requirements related to products and services, basically ensuring or taking a look of how does the organization identify the requirements to products and services. And the auditor needs to ensure that the organization has the ability to meet the defined requirements and substantiate the claims, in other words, prove the claims for its products and services. And also the auditor needs to review any documented information. We're talking websites, catalogs, or brochures, for example. The auditor, as I said before, conducting interviews is always a great way to gather information. The third subclause of requirements for products and services is the review of requirements related to products and services. Basically, the organization is required to ensure that it's able to meet the requirements for the products and services being offered, and it needs to conduct a review. The organization needs to conduct a review before committing to supply products and services. So basically, the organization is expected to review whether they can provide what they intend to sell or not. Let's take the example of a systems organization. A contract review should be in place, either using paper or electronic documents like a confirmation email or quote proposals. Now, this review must take into consideration customer requirements, the install and any afterwork like maintenance, follow-up, services, and so on. And also in this review, the organization must consider the elements that need to be completed to ensure this job is fitted correctly, like meter reading tests or commissioning forms, or of course operational checks and so on. And also in this review, there must be anything. The organization must take into account anything else the organization needs to implement, and of course legal requirements or statutory and regulatory requirements, and any variations or any changes. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to review any documented information like websites, catalogs or brochures. The auditor needs to also evaluate the process or the method used to review the requirements to or related to products and services. And also the auditor needs to understand who's responsible for the review and decision making in providing products and services. If any changes to the requirements for the products and services happen, like maybe any orders change, the organization is required to track and document that. So in the case of changes to the requirements, documented information is amended, and also relevant persons should be made aware of the impact of changing requirements. Persons could be like, of course, the customers and maybe the operation or the production teams. Now, the organization is required to retain documented information on the results of the review that we talked about in the last or the previous subclause. When we say results, could be maybe emails, could be orders submitted and accepted by the customers. And the organization should retain documented information on any new requirements for products and services. As for auditing this requirement, this is a simple task. The auditor needs to evaluate the change management, how the change is managed in the contracts and orders, maybe, or how are relevant persons aware and informed of the change. With this lesson, we begin talking about subclause 3 of operation, which is of course design and development of products and services. This subclause is in turn divided into 6 other subclauses, or let's call them maybe parts. So 6 other subclauses or parts. Now, in some cases, the organization might be able to justify the exclusion of certain subclauses or parts without necessarily excluding the entire subclause, meaning 8.3, of course. For example, an organization with an already established product and or service design might only need to ensure that design changes are managed in accordance with the requirement. Now, generally, or basically, or maybe generally, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain, so introduce a development and design process that is appropriate to ensure the subsequent provision of products and services. Now, as I said, the organization might be able to justify the exclusion of certain parts. So the organization needs to understand the applicability of certain parts or subclauses, so whether they're applicable or not. So the auditor will need to verify that any claims of non-applicability are valid. So basically review the justification of the exclusion. And also the auditor needs to review how the decision to proceed with design and development is taken. Of course having risks and opportunities, or identifying risks and opportunities, because risk-based thinking is always implemented in basically every requirement with the standard. Of course, when we say risks and opportunities, including cost implications. So have risks and opportunities been considered, and have all relevant interested parties, whether internal or external, been consulted. The second subclause of the design and development of products and services is of course the planning of the design and development of products and services. So simply put, the organization is required to plan the design and development process in order to determine the stages of this process as well as the controls needed. Now, when planning the design and development process, a few things the organization has to take into consideration, like how long will it take to survey, how long will it take to gather information and question, and what surveying skills are needed, and who should review the design, and who can confirm if it is right or not, and what needs to be done to check if it is right or not, and who would be responsible for all of that, and of course what resources are needed. We're talking money, of course. Again, we're talking money. We're talking tools. We're talking, of course, if any subcontractors are needed, and ensuring all involved communication. Maybe, for example, like surveyor and the designer and the administrator or the responsible, and checking that checking that what you are designing, what the organization is designing, is what the customer wants and expects. So again, this is basically what the whole management system, the whole management system goal is: customer satisfaction, and what other things are needed, like products and services. We're talking external products and services, or products and services from external contractors, which we'll talk about in later videos. And the control needed to ensure it goes to plan, it goes through the plan, and from customers and interested parties like subcontractors, manufacturers, and monitoring stations, and ensuring that documenting the above has been considered. So all of this needs to be documented. Now, to audit this requirement, the auditor needs to ensure the flow of the design planning is going well. So what is the overall flow of the design planning, and how it is described, of course by the personnel. And of course, the auditor needs to evaluate the resources and the competence present, and what part of the design will be outsourced. So the auditor needs to evaluate the outsourced resources and who will be responsible. Though the auditor needs to understand who will be responsible and the authorities defined, and if the authorities are defined, and how are whether internal and external interfaces between various groups are whether they are identified and managed, and are the required verification, validation, and review points are defined, and are the main milestones and timelines identified. So the organization needs to put a timeline when planning the design and the development process. And is the implementation and effectiveness of the plan monitored, and is the plan updated and communicated within the organization to all relevant functions as necessary. The third subclause of the design and development process is the design and development inputs. So basically, the organization is required to determine the requirements essential, the needs essential for the specific types of products and services to be designed and developed. Now, so basically, the organization needs to consider what requirements and what needs before starting to design and develop any products and services. Now, so basically, what needs to be considered to design, and we're talking maybe standards or codes of practice. Codes of practice is a practical guide to achieving these standards of health, safety, and welfare. The organization also needs to consider design or development failure. Take the example of the Samsung Galaxy Note 7, which heats up and it burns. And of course all of this needs to be documented. So the organization needs to retain documented information on the design and development inputs. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to develop an understanding of how the organization identifies its own inputs. We're talking, of course, products, services, and processes. We're talking financial, environmental, health, and safety issues. Has the organization considered all of this, and the organization risks and impacts, and the customer's requirements and expectations, and statutory and regulatory requirements? We're talking, of course, legal requirements applicable to the product and service to be, of course, designed and developed. Of course, how the organization identifies and determines all of this. The auditor needs to evaluate the risks, the possible implications for the customer satisfaction, and issues that the organization may encounter if some relevant inputs are not considered. So what are the risks, what are the consequences when some inputs related or relevant to the products and services to be designed, and the products to be designed. So what will happen if the organization excludes those inputs? The fourth subclause of design and development is the design and development controls. So the organization is required to apply controls to the design and development process. Design and development controls are aimed at providing assurance that the outputs of a design and development activities have met the requirements for this activity. The organization is required to retain documented information on the control activities concerning the design and development, as stated in here. So the organization is to retain documented information on defined outcomes, including specifications, design intent, functional and performance requirements, and customer end expectations. Also, the organization is to retain documented information on the design review process with functional representation from the customer, engineering, production, quality, and project management, and design review gates like preliminary design review, detailed design review, critical design review, and commercial or technical consideration, and authorized progression to next stage. So basically, the organization needs to document that it has what it takes to go through each stage and go through the design. Also, we need to consider the verification activities like modeling, simulation, alternative calculations, and comparison with other proven designs, and of course like experiments. We're talking tests and specialist technical reviews. Also, the validation activities needs to be considered, like functional testing, performance testing, trials, prototypes, demonstration, and simulation. All of this is in the validation process or the validation activities. Now, validation could be simple, like a new design of office furniture could be validated by testing prototypes and testing of initial samples of the finished product. And also, the validation could be complex, like components in electronic systems, because it will have to comply with requirements of other systems. The organization also needs to consider management of actions arising from design reviews and what actions the organization will take on problems found, and also arising from verification or validation activities like action registers, ownership, timescales, escalation, and changes to risk profile. Now, as for auditing, we're going to go through auditing three parts. We're going to go through the auditing of the design and development review, and then the verification, and then the validation. As for auditing the review for design and development, the auditor needs to review whether reviews occur at planned stages throughout the design process, and whether the organization has carried out the reviews in a systematic way involving representative of the functions concerned with the stages being reviewed. So we're talking here who are the representative, who are responsible for the reviews, and whether this review whether these reviews are carried out in a systematic way. And also, has the organization considered all original and any new inputs, and whether revised inputs and outputs been reviewed and approved by those with the relevant responsibility and authorities. And does the output demonstrate the suitability, the adequacy, and effectiveness of the design product or service, and whether there are adequate records of these reviews. Now, as for auditing the verification of the design and development, the auditor needs to evaluate the verification, whether the verifications are planned and that the verification is performed as appropriate during the process of the design and development, and also whether the completed design or development is acceptable and the results are consistent with traceable to the initial requirements, and also whether the completed design or development is the result of implementation of a proper sequence of events. So we're talking here a series of action. The auditor needs to ensure that the design or development provides safety, security, and compliance with other requirements and design inputs. And also the auditor needs to take a look or review the evidence, or ensure that evidence is available to demonstrate that the verification results and any further actions have been recorded and confirmed when actions are completed. Now, as for auditing the validation for the design and development, the auditor needs to ensure that there are records to confirm that the validations have been carried out. When we say validation, confirmation could be by examination. In other words, is the validation process capable of checking that the final product or service will meet or does meet customers' needs. And also the auditor needs to evaluate the validation, needs to ensure that the validation was carried out in accordance with the planned arrangements for validation. And the validation indicates that the resulting product or service is capable of meeting the requirements of the specification. And also the auditor needs to ensure that there are records of any actions necessary to correct non-compliance with the design and development inputs and the reasons for these deviations. So if there are any maybe changes, if there are any problems, what actions will the organization take, and the auditor needs to take a look at the records of these actions. The fifth subclause of design and development is the design and development outputs. The organization is required to ensure that its management systems outputs are complying with the identified needs in order to ensure that the resulting product can fulfill its intended use, and of course we have customer satisfaction. Now, when we say outputs can include information relevant to marketing, sales and purchasing, or production, or quality assurance, or information for service provision and maintenance of the product after delivery, and should be provided in a form that enables verification and validation activities to be performed. Now, the organization is required to ensure that outputs meet the input requirements. This is pretty straightforward. If products or services does not meet the requirements, it's useless, and the organization have failed to fulfill customer needs. To meet requirements, it's critical that these requirements were very clear in the first place. Second, it should be suitable for subsequent, so the outputs should be suitable for subsequent processes for the provision of products and services. In other words, it should be very clear that the quality management system of the organization is able to produce products or service with specification, rules and regulation. And also the outputs should include or refer to appropriate monitoring and measuring requirements and their acceptance criteria. This can be accomplished by very close communication with customers and other stakeholders in the process. The organization is also required to ensure that outputs define the characteristics of the products and services that are essential for their intended purpose and their safe and proper provision. In other words, the products or service should function as intended, and the organization should fully understand if the product or service is safe and properly functioning. Take the example of maybe a car. So maybe a customer will request a car without brakes. The car still works, but that would not be safe though. So the organization needs to include brakes in the car, and also all this information needs to be documented, maybe either through a register or some other form. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to obtain evidence from the project selected to confirm that information regarding the completion of design and development stages is available, and also evidence to confirm that the design and development process has been completed for the stage under review, and also obtain evidence to ensure that the design and development outputs have been confirmed. And also the auditor needs to review documented information like the registers. The sixth subclause of design and development is design and development changes. The organization is required to identify, review and control changes made during or subsequent to the design and development of products and services, of course to the extent necessary to ensure that there is no adverse impact on conformity to requirements. So basically the organization needs to retain documented information on the design and development changes, if any changes occur during the design and development process, and also the documented information on the results of reviews of changes, meaning keeping records of changes, maybe to schematics, for example. And also the organization needs to retain documented information on the authorization of the changes, in other words, who agreed on any changes, and also on the control on the actions taken to prevent adverse impacts, in other words on the controls to stop things from being done incorrectly. Let's take the example of maybe a client who wants a fixed camera instead of a pen tilt zoom camera, so a PTZ, so a fixed camera instead of a PTZ camera. The organization is required to document that, of course considering risks, cost, and the output, and ensure that the client accepts these changes. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to see whether the organization has identified or properly identified and communicated the sources and requests for the changes, and whether the organization has evaluated the impact of any change, and whether there is any additional design, proving, or testing undertaken where appropriate, and whether the effects of the changes on the products or services already delivered are evaluated by the organization, and has the organization given appropriate approval before a change is implemented. This could include legal approval or approval by the client itself. And has the organization fully documented the changes and records, and has the organization documented records including information regarding any necessary additional actions. Subclause 4 of operation is the control of externally provided processes, products, and services. Basically, the organization needs to consider the impacts of suppliers on what they provide the customer, and how it may reflect if something goes wrong when they recommend a product. For example, like manufacturers that you've been using as an organization go out of business and are suddenly unable to supply goods. So when we say external providers, we're talking suppliers, we're talking subcontractors or associate companies. Generally, or basically, the organization is required to ensure that externally provided processes, products, and services conform to requirements. Now, when we say processes or products or services, could be in the form of raw material, so our organization is purchasing raw material from the supplier, or maybe hiring or outsourcing a corrective maintenance team. Now, our organization is required to determine the control applied to externally provided processes, products, and services. So now our organization is kind of like the customer, and so it needs to evaluate the processes, products, and services provided by those external providers or those suppliers through self-assessment questionnaires and through audits that the supplier's quality management system and the supplier's processes. Now, our organization is required to determine and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring of performance, and re-evaluation of external providers based on their ability to provide processes or products and services in accordance with requirements. We could take a few examples like technology. Do they have the technology to supply what we want? And quality, what quality standards do they meet? And maybe responsiveness, are they responsive to our needs? And delivery, can they deliver on time? And is the price or the cost acceptable? And environmental impact, what is their impact on environment and the society? and this evaluation needs to be documented, so documented information is required. The second part of the control of externally provided processes, products, and services is the type of extent control. Basically, the organization is required to ensure that externally provided processes, products, or services do not adversely affect its ability to consistently deliver conforming products and services to its customers. So the organization needs to ensure that the supplied product or service meets the specified requirements. Now, control mechanism could include the check of products at delivery, site acceptance tests, or second-party supplier audits. And if supplier audits are required, if maybe our organization requires the supplier for an audit, this should be written in the contract with the suppliers. And the organization criteria for determining the need, the type, and the scope of second-party supplier audits must be based on risk-based thinking. So, and as I said before, risk-based thinking is not a standalone act or a standalone event. It's implemented in basically every other requirements. So the organization is required to identify the risks and opportunities that could arise from doing business with that certain supplier. Now, externally provided processes, products, and services must remain under the organization's quality management system control through documented information. These documented information should include the supplier name, the date of the purchase, and the purchase order number. One thing I should note here is that purchase orders should only be ordered by the purchasing manager or the accounts manager by the request of the purchasing manager. So as I was saying, the documented information should include the supplier name, the date of the purchase order number, and the items required, what items, what products, and what services or what processes the organization is requiring or is demanding, and how much, the quantity, the required delivery date, the quoted prices were applicable or known. So we're talking about the price here, the cost, and any information deemed critical for the supply of the material should also be noted. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor should review documented information in maybe a list indicating which are the approved external providers, and that this documented information is kept up to date. Maybe the organization shall change the providers or the suppliers. The auditor shall also verify whether orders have been placed to external providers satisfying the defined criteria. As we were saying before, maybe the organization requires the supplier to have an audit, and that should be written in the contract. The auditor shall also ensure that there is effective performance of outsourced processes, and also the auditor shall evaluate whether the activities which are necessary for ensuring the specified requirements have been met are carried out. And also the auditor shall verify that risk-based thinking has been applied by the organization in determining appropriate controls over those external providers or suppliers. The third part for the control of externally provided processes, products, and services is information for external providers. The organization is basically required, where appropriate, to communicate not just the products or services they wish to receive, but also any processes they want the external provider to undertake on their behalf. So the organization needs to describe the products to be purchased basically by defining the product approval requirements, maybe a certificate of conformity, and by defining intended verification arrangements by maybe witness testing or certification, and by defining personnel qualifications and quality, environmental, and safety requirements, and also describe the products to be purchased by maintaining records. Now, the organization needs to ensure that items are verified upon product receipt or service delivery to verify that they conform to the quality management system requirements, the competence of external personnel, the purchase orders, the purchasing specification, the purchasing agreements, the release certificates, the certificates of conformity, the inspection and acceptance tests, the products specifications, and the national or international standards. Now, the receiving personnel must identify and inspect the items, goods, and of course materials, and match them against the delivery notes by the confirmation of identification using purchase order number, drawing numbers, material markings, etc. And the confirmation of adherence to delivery schedule, the confirmation of conformance to purchase order requirements, the confirmation of correct quantities, the visual examination for obvious defects of course, the products, the measurement, comparison to drawings where required. We've got drawings, there could be comparison of the to drawings, and specify certification or documentation as required. Now, for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to confirm that the specification quoted in a purchase order is the same as the specification contained in the design or the drawing, or the specification received from the customer. And also the auditor needs to identify whether or not there were discussions between the organization and the potential suppliers regarding the design specification of critical components during the design process or prior to an order being placed. The auditor also needs to see whether there was some kind of a form of approval of the specification before the final specification or order was confirmed to the external provider. And also the auditor needs to see whether the purchase order contain or refer to any statutory or regulatory based, so legal, so does the purchase refer to any legal requirements. The fifth subclause of operation is the production and service provision. This subclause is in turn divided into other 5 subclauses or 5 parts. The first one is the control of production and service provision, so the control of the production. Now, the organization is required to control the manner in which products are produced and services are provided. So, the organization should seek and record evidence that it has controlled the conditions by which the products or services are provided, ensuring that documented information that defines the characteristics of the product or service is available. So information that describes the product or service. Also documented information that contains the activities that need to be performed to produce the product or deliver the service, and that this specifies the result that are to be achieved. And also the organization is required to monitor and measure which at appropriate points in the production process to ensure that both the processes themselves and the process outputs meet the organization's acceptance criteria. So the organization needs to make sure that it has what it needs to measure and test installed systems, and also it has suitable environment and infrastructure, basically making sure that the organization has the right support, maybe from the office and from the site, to complete the job. And also suitable monitoring and measuring resources need to be available, and personnel need to be competent and where necessary appropriately qualified, and maybe through resumes and training records. We also need updated work instruction, and the product and service release, delivery, post-delivery activities need to be implemented. We're going to talk about these two in later videos. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to review documented information, like the personal files or the training records of the personnel, which of course is basically ensuring the competence of the personnel. The auditor needs to also observe and evaluate the measurement and monitoring of the resources, as well as the infrastructure and environment. The auditor needs to ensure that the organization has suitable infrastructure and environment for its operation of processes. The second subclause of the production and service provision is the identification and traceability. The organization must seek and record evidence that its products and services are identified when appropriate and their status with regards to monitoring and measuring are identified throughout the manufacturing processes. Basically, the organization needs to establish a traceability system. This system should track components from raw materials through the inspection and testing and then the final release. So the organization first must have a process in place for the identification and traceability of the outputs through physical part marking, through labeling, through tags, barcodes, visual indicators, part segregation, laid down areas, and maybe storage racks. And also this traceability and the identification system needs to be implemented through the design, development, manufacture and delivery stages. We're talking establishing the identity and status of products and maintaining that identity and status, and we're talking about maintaining records of serial or batch numbers. As for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to ensure that the products are identified as appropriate, and its status with regards to monitoring and measuring is identified throughout the product realization processes. The auditor also needs to ensure that the organization is controlling and recording the unique identification of the product. The third subclass of this production and service provision is the property belonging to customers or external providers. Basically, the organization is required to seek and record evidence that they have extended their treatment of customer or external providers' property. When we say property, we're talking about maybe intellectual information such as data, addresses or prices. We're talking about materials, we're talking tools or equipment, we're talking maybe customer keys like passwords and so on. So the organization needs to have a clear process protecting any property belonging to maybe a client, to a third-party suppliers, and so on. Let's take the example of maybe a team of subcontractors who bring their own equipment. There should be a clear process on how that's managed, even if they're the one who's responsible for their own tools. And when personnel of the organization are working with that equipment belonging to the customers or maybe to the subcontractors, employees must be careful with that property, ensuring that it's not lost or damaged. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to ensure that the organization has clearly identified any and all customer property and whether the organization has established a process to protect that property. And of course the auditor needs to evaluate that process, and also evaluate the process established for contacting the customer when these items are either lost, damaged, or otherwise found unsuitable for the process. In this part, we're talking about preservation. Basically, the organization is required to protect and preserve the product during internal processing and delivery to the intended destination. Basically, the organization needs to ensure that the supply of services are protected. For example, ensuring that products delivered to site are not damaged and are delivered when maybe an engineer is on site to receive the product. Now, this will happen on a few steps. First, the identification. So basically, the organization needs to ensure that products are properly identified and do not become mixed with other orders or products. So this is kind of like the identification and traceability, but it's a requirement, not as applicable. So the organization expects to see all products are clearly identified through labeling and so on, and we've seen this in the previous lesson or video. Second, we're talking about handling. This may include bulk handling, using moving equipment or physical contact where handling may influence product conformity. And third, we've got packaging, ensuring that labeling and marking of shipped products are sufficient to enable adequate identification and traceability back through the quality management system. So the organization needs to establish methods for packaging the product to preserve its integrity. And then we've got storage. This should include storage condition to prevent deterioration, damage, or loss. Maybe there is a temperature change. Maybe there is anything that could damage the product. And we've got then protection. So we're talking raw materials, in process materials. We're talking about inspected product, and non-conforming product and product ready for shipping should also be identified with its status and protected from any unintended alteration. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to ensure that preservation measures are taken, and the auditor needs to ensure that legal or regulatory requirements are taken. So legal and regulatory requirements applicable to the preservation in the industry. The fifth part of subclause 5 is the post-delivery activities. Basically, the organization needs to meet requirements for post-delivery activities associated with the products and services. So this is about post-delivery, after delivery. So what an organization should do after they have supplied a product or service. These activities can include actions under warranty provisions and contractual obligations like maintenance services, or activities like supplementary services like recycling or final disposal. Now, the organization, while doing these activities, must take into account the statutory and regulatory requirements. Of course, we're talking about legal requirements, and also the potential undesired consequences associated with its products and services. Basically, things that could go wrong. And also the nature, the use, and unintended lifetime of its products and services. Basically, how products should be used and how long they should last. And also customer requirements, and of course expectations, and also customer feedbacks. These are the things that the organization needs to take into account while doing those post-delivery activities or actions. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to evaluate those activities or actions and needs to see how the organization is dealing with the post-delivery. And also the auditor needs to review any documented information like warranty reports, installation reports, minutes, and maybe maintenance records. The sixth subclause of production and service provision is the control of changes. The organization is required to review and control changes for production or service provision to the extent necessary to ensure continuing conformity with requirements. Basically, the organization is required to implement a process for responding maybe to unplanned changes that are considered essential in order to ensure that products or services continue to meet their specific requirements. Maybe, for example, a company that wants to expand and decides to separate the sales department from the design department. This company or this organization needs to retain documented information about that change, and also who authorized that change, and also the actions arising from the change. What will happen after the change. And so we're talking about identifying the risks and opportunities that comes after the change. So risk-based thinking needs to be implemented. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to see whether the impact of the change is evaluated, whether the risks and opportunities are identified, to determine the effects of the change on the work or the process or the products already delivered. The auditor needs to also see what process control documentation like procedures or form will need updating as a result of the change, and also was the change approved prior to implementation, including where applicable. So basically taking into consideration the customer and legal requirements or legal authority. So was the change approved by the customer and by the authority, by the legal authority? the auditor needs to also review any documented information and needs to ensure that retained documented information indicate the source of the change in information on necessary actions and approvals. The sixth subclause of operation is the release of products and services. The organization is required to implement planned arrangements at appropriate stages to verify that the product and service requirements have been met. So, the organization must show evidence that a process like methods, techniques, and formats are in place to monitor and measure the characteristics of products to verify that requirements are being met. Now, the release of products or service delivery must not be completed until planned requirements have been met. When we say planned requirements or arrangement, and we've already talked about this before, so we're talking about the design verification and design validation, like modeling, simulations, experiments, trials, prototypes, etc. We're talking about destructive and non-destructive testing, so customer acceptance testing. We're talking product certification, qualification. We're talking third-party qualification from a regulator, recognized society, or independent testing body, and etc. So these are the planned arrangement steps or actions. Now, when we say the release of a product, we're talking to the release to the next operation, and then the release to an internal customer until the release to a final customer. Now, the organization must monitor and measure product characteristics to ensure that they're able to demonstrate product characteristics are continually met and to demonstrate the evidence of conformity with product requirements. The organization also needs to retain documented information to provide evidence that acceptance criteria have been met. And this is where the auditor will verify those documented information, will review those documented information and verify that they are maintained to provide evidence of conformity. Records or documented information like certificate of conformity, like release certificate, and like regulatory certificate. The auditor needs to also see who are the person, or is it one person or multiple persons authorizing the release of products. We're talking about the name, authorized signatories, we're talking user identification, and also their authority status. The sixth subclause of operation is the release of products and services. The organization is required to implement planned arrangements at appropriate stages to verify that the product and service requirements have been met. So, the organization must show evidence that a process like methods, techniques, and formats are in place to monitor and measure the characteristics of products to verify that requirements are being met. Now, the release of products or service delivery must not be completed until planned requirements have been met. When we say planned requirements or arrangement, and we've already talked about this before, so we're talking about the design verification and design validation, like modeling, simulations, experiments, trials, prototypes, etc. We're talking about destructive and non-destructive testing, so customer acceptance testing. We're talking product certification, qualification. We're talking third-party qualification from a regulator, recognized society, or independent testing body, and etc. So these are the planned arrangement steps or actions. Now, when we say the release of a product, we're talking to the release to the next operation, and then the release to an internal customer until the release to a final customer. Now, the organization must monitor and measure product characteristics to ensure that they're able to demonstrate product characteristics are continually met and to demonstrate the evidence of conformity with product requirements. The organization also needs to retain documented information to provide evidence that acceptance criteria have been met. And this is where the auditor will verify those documented information, will review those documented information and verify that they are maintained to provide evidence of conformity. records or documented information like certificate of conformity, like release certificate, and like regulatory certificate. The auditor needs to also see who are the person, or is it one person or multiple persons authorizing the release of products. We're talking about the name, authorized signatories, we're talking user identification, and also their authority status. Control of non-conforming outputs basically requires the organization to ensure that outputs that do not conform to their requirements are identified and controlled to prevent their unintended use or delivery. Basically, the quality management system should have clear control mechanisms and process in plan to implement corrective actions and basically deal with non-conforming outputs. When we say deal with non-conforming outputs, we're talking correction. Correction means identifying what's wrong and fixing it. Of course, after fixing the non-conforming output, the organization needs to verify that it has actually fixed it by putting it back through maybe any testing or verification process that it has. And it also, in dealing with non-conforming outputs, also means segregation, containment, return, or suspension of provision of products and services. Essentially, the ability to ensure that the organization knows how many non-conforming outputs were created and what, if any, have escaped, and that the organization can return them to the previous process or request the customer to return them. Basically, just stopping producing the non-conforming outputs. And then we've got informing the customer. Informing the customer means ensuring that the customers know what the situation is and how big the situation or the problem is and what risks there are. And so the organization needs to be 100% open and honest. And then we've got obtaining authorization for acceptance under concession, like saying, okay, this ones I'll accept the outputs if they, and we've got a condition there. And also the organization needs to verify that the corrected non-conforming outputs are actually conforming to the requirements. And also the organization needs to record what it's doing when things go wrong. So it needs to retain documented information that describes the non-conformity. Describes the non-conformity in a way that anyone could understand, and not just technical persons. And documented information that also describes the actions taken. Did you put everything on hold? Did you recall? Did you investigate how it happened? And did you follow up with the supplier? And did you review the training of people, and so on? Documented information should also describe any concessions obtained. In other words, what was allowed and what wasn't. Was it for a limited quantity or a limited time? Were there any limits on what would be okay and what wouldn't? Also, the documented information should identify the authority deciding the action in respect of the non-conformity. The organization should have a list of those internal or external persons who are authorized to make the decision. We're talking the name and the position of those persons. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to see whether the personnel have the power to decide, have the power to, or the authority to decide the disposition of the service, like immediately terminating the service or replacing the service provided or offering an alternative. Also, the auditor needs to see needs to ensure that the organization needs to review or needs to evaluate the organization's customer claims and complaints processes, and also needs to see whether there are any temporary corrections that are implemented to mitigate the effect of non-conformity, like refund, like credit, like upgrading, etc. And also, the auditor needs to see the identification, the segregation, and replacement of the relevant service equipment and the service providers and environment.